While most of the current focus on women in mining tends to be on their employment and advancement, there are a range of gender related issues confronting the sector in its downstream value chain. These include the position of women in stakeholder groups like local communities and suppliers, for instance, where mines can improve their contribution to inclusive development. Well, that's according to Lisl Pullinger, who's the principal ESG consultant at SRK Consulting. We chat to her in our social newscast, brought to you by socialtv.co.za and hosted by me, Sam Marshall. Lisl, thank you very much for your time. I'm conducting this interview on the back of an article that you wrote about women affected by mining beyond the workplace. Just quickly give us a sense of what this current landscape looks like for women.
Thanks, Sam, and thanks for the opportunity to chat about this. Um, Sam, if you listen to the narratives of women in mining currently, you often will hear things like the pay gap, women not being appointed to senior technical positions, etc. But in fact, if we take a wider look at how the mining industry as a whole impacts women, it stretches far, far beyond employment and those women who happen to apply to the mine for a job or who are working for a mine. It also impacts the women in the host communities of mining quite significantly.
Why is it important, Lisl, to factor in some of the issues that you've highlighted? We have often talked about the role of women within the workspace. It's undeniable. We've often talked about the pay gap disparity that exists within the corporate structure. But why did you feel it's so important to highlight the position of women within stakeholder groups, within local communities, within supply chain management, and talk about this idea called inclusive development? Why is it an important discussion?
I think it's a critically important discussion, Sam, for the following reason. If you look at mining host communities from a vulnerability perspective, and you acknowledge that often people in communities have different layers of vulnerability superimposed over each other, then women are often the ones who have 2, 3, 4, 5 layers of vulnerability overlaid over their lives. Let me give you a practical example. Let's say we have a woman living in rural Limpopo, close to a mine. She is already, if you look at the statistics of the province, she's already systemically vulnerable. Looking at the demographics of Limpopo, you will see the education, the number of females who got matric is lower than males. The number of females who are digitally literate is lower than males. She might have had teenage pregnancies, one or two, or maybe even more. So that already, without there even being a mine close by, she is systemically vulnerable because of demographics. But not only that, if you look at cultural practices and the role of a voice of females in her community, she might have an added layer of vulnerability that her voice isn't deemed important. It's difficult for her to make her voice heard over those of the males in her community. So she could also have a culturally embedded systemic vulnerability. Another type of vulnerability that she could be exposed to, and if you look at the statistics in Limpopo, probably is that of poverty and livelihood. She might struggle to keep her children fed, to keep a roof over their head. So without the mine even being there, this female in this host community is already vulnerable. Now, if a mine comes, opens next door, advertises for jobs that are typically male orientated, a type of historically male orientated job, she is at an additional disadvantage because she doesn't have the right skills and capabilities to apply for that job. Apart from that, let's say the mine needs to expand and they need to negotiate with her community to take some of the fields that they've been growing vegetables or maize on. In her community, in her culture, she doesn't have land rights. The male in her household has the land rights, which immediately means that she has less of the voice in what happens during that process when the mine has to resettle them. So as you can see from this brief example, there often are different layers of vulnerability. First of all, systemic, that has nothing to do with the mine. And then when the mine opens up or the mine expands, women who are already exposed are impacted even more.
When you give those examples, the obvious follow-up question for me is that, and you use the primary example of when a mine expands, but we have mining sites that have been established for years. Through your experience, have you found that those women that are living next to established mines that have been part of that community for more than 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they're still experiencing some of the issues that you've highlighted?
Oh, for sure. For sure. In South Africa, we have robust legislation that helps to guide mines in their social development initiatives. However, it's only the past few years that the gender voice or the gender lens in deciding what those economic development opportunities should be has been highlighted. So let me give you another practical example. I must give kudos to the mining industry. They've come a long way from just deciding, announcing and defending which development opportunities they are going to build or support, to a process that's more participative, where the community can participate in and have a voice and a say in which development opportunities they would like to see in their communities. Now, the next shift that's coming, apart from participation, is that this participation, whereas it was very focused towards the traditional authority and horo system in South Africa, it's becoming more and more important that there's inclusive and diverse voices heard in this process of how and what should we develop, not for the community, but with the community.
How do we, and my final question, I mean, if this picture, and you've said that the mining companies have come a long way in dealing with some of these systemic issues, surely it's still big enough of an issue for you to write a thought leadership piece on. What are the current challenges that need to be addressed almost immediately? And just from an outside lens perspective, what would need to happen in order for those challenges to be addressed?
So I often say that the first step to systemic change, because what we really want to see here is systemic change that covers the entire region or a town or a municipality. The first step to that level of systemic change is a paradigm shift. And that is where my colleagues in the mining industry still have ways to go. a paradigm shift away from what can we do for you, to a paradigm of saying, what can we do with you? I often, when I do training, I say, remember, the people in the community surrounding your mind is not an empty bucket with holes in it. It's a bucket filled with all kinds of assets, human skills, natural assets, innovations that's unique to that community. And whereas in the past, the mining industry was more patriarchal, and they would say, oh, we're sure this community needs this, let's do it. The paradigm shift is to, let's see what's there already, what assets this community already built up by itself. And how do we leverage of those assets and those champions who are building these community strengths without outside support? Let's leverage of that and build it further. So that's the one important thing. In South Africa, and very much so in the rest of Africa as well, the role between what the government should do or the municipality should do and the mine should do is very blurry. In areas where there's lack of water supply, lack of electricity, inevitably the expectation is that the mine will provide it. I think one of the big challenges that we have in South Africa is that public-private partnership to delineate those roles better, and rather for the private sector to supply capacity to do it with the public sector instead of taking over the role of the government.